Hello everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky, and I am in Greenville, Tennessee. This is the final resting place of Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States. Johnson is the most controversial president in all of U.S. history. He also is the one who comes from the most humble upbringings. Johnson was born on December 29, 1808 in Raleigh, North Carolina to two illiterate parents who had no formal education of their own and had several children before Andrew Johnson. His dad actually died from an accident when Andrew was just 3 years old, and his mother was a laundress, now which required her to go into homes around town unaccompanied and to do her labor. Now, the fact that Andrew Johnson looks so much differently from his older brothers and sister, the rumor around town was that his mother bore him from another man. Johnson never got a formal education. He loved the learning of how to read, and as he was being apprenticed out as an indentured servant to a local tailor shop here in Raleigh, he started to learn how to read. There were people that were reading books, and he started getting his love of learning from the tailor shop in Raleigh. Now, when he was indentured with him and his brother, they fled. They ran away. So they were escaped indentured servants, and they traveled around the area where Andrew Johnson would eventually come to Greenville for the first time. He fell in love with it. He spent some time down in Columbia, Tennessee, which is where James K. Polk was living at the time. And he fell in love with the area, and when he wasn't able to broker out a deal with the tailor shop back in Raleigh, he brought his mother and his stepfather to Greenville, and he got a house with his family, and we met Eliza, and he started his tailor shop here. The tailor shop still exists. Its original shop in its original location. It's protected by another building right across from his house that he lived here when he first moved here, and that house is still standing. From the late 1820s until the 1850s, he lived in this little house across from his tailor shop, and his wife taught him how to read. His wife taught him how to be more, right, how to read better, how to basically be a better orator. His wife made him into the statesman that he would later become. See, he ran for the city council here, and he met a guy by the name of Mordecai Lincoln, and Mordecai Lincoln would actually be the officiant who would marry him and his wife Eliza. Now, we're going to get to a little bit more of that in a minute because it's really interesting history, but Johnson got the political bug. He became the mayor of Greenville. In 1835, under the new state constitution, where Nashville became the permanent capital, he ran for the state house. The difference thing here is that he didn't really pick a party. He kind of voted for the Whigs, voted for the Democrats, and this hurt his relationship with Andrew Jackson, who he proclaimed to be a big supporter of, but because he wasn't as a staunch supporter on the issues that Jackson would have liked at the local level, it created a rift between him and Andrew Jackson. Johnson, after serving some time in the state house, moved to the state senate, and from the state senate he would then decide, well, he's going to run for the House of Representatives. He comes to Washington. Now, Eliza doesn't travel with him. She stays home. She doesn't really like to travel. He tries to push a bill known as the Homestead Act. Now, being a Jacksonian-style politician, one of the major aspects of his policies were the poor, non-slave-owning whites. That these people really had very little prospects and very little chance of being successful, and they had very hard time getting land because the wealthy slave-owning white slave owners controlled everything. And so one of the things he kept trying to push was the Homestead Act. He actually met Abraham Lincoln when Abraham Lincoln did his single term in Congress, just right at the beginning of the War of the Mexican-American War. They actually started talking about, family, and that Johnson lived in northeastern Tennessee, and Lincoln says, "I have family in northeast Tennessee." He said, "I have a great uncle named Mordecai who lives in Greenville," and Johnson's like, "That's my hometown." And come to find out, Mordecai Lincoln, the guy who officiated the wedding between him and his wife was Abraham Lincoln's great uncle. That's, small world. And even back then, when there was no technology, it was, the world was much bigger, and it was still small enough to have Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson have a connection at such an early point in Johnson's life and in Lincoln's very first, national political office. So after his term in the House of Representatives, he came back and he ran for governor. Now, he was a successful governor as far as he was trying to advocate for the average everyday man. He pushed against some of the bigger landowners and the robber barons. He said, the average everyday people, the rail splitters, needed to have a champion. He pursued the rights of the everyday white man to have a step up. Now, this is the time period of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Blacks were not considered to be equal to whites. The fact of the matter in U.S. history, and this is something we have to acknowledge, that blacks were not considered to be equal to whites, especially down in the South and not even in the North. Even free blacks had to actually have paperwork and actually had to have other things to allow them to be free. Johnson had slaves. He paid his slaves, and he actually tried to keep his slaves' family together. A couple of his slaves talked very, very, very highly of him after his death, and I think the last one died in the early 20th century in New York City, and proclaimed how much he enjoyed and liked Johnson. One of the slaves, Sam, who was freed, was still traveled around, and Henry, who was freed and still traveled around with Johnson, were big supporters of Andrew Johnson throughout his entire life. So he comes back. He doesn't want to talk about abolitionists. He doesn't want to support the abolitionists, but he also wants to support try to keep some of the Northern Democrats on his side, because he has further political ambitions. He tries very, very hard to kind of be liked by everybody, and it fails miserably. He is booted out of the governor's office, but then is able to run for the U.S. Senate seat. And here's where things get really interesting. This is where he meets Jefferson Davis. Now, Jefferson Davis is a huge secessionist, huge expansionist with slavery, and Johnson really isn't. He's, agnostic on some of this stuff. He believes that, each state should have its right to do so, to choose what it wants, but it wasn't so much that, that there wasn't a reason to leave the Union. In fact, Johnson even talked to Davis about, if we just stayed in, at the midterm elections, we could prevent anything that Lincoln tried to do, and then the Democrats could take the Senate in the next election, and we could end all this peacefully. Davis didn't listen, and this would become the beginning of Davis's and Johnson's bitter hatred towards each other. Because he was the only U.S. senator from a southern seceding state that stayed with the Union, Lincoln saw this and admired him. In fact, once Tennessee was mostly reconquered by the Union forces, Johnson was asked to leave the U.S. Senate and return to Nashville and become the military governor, as a brigadier governor of the state of Tennessee. He was very successful in this aspect as far as he had Union troops at the Capitol. He also sought a ending of slavery in the state of Tennessee with his own Emancipation Proclamation. See, the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln did was only in the territories that the North did not have control of. Now, that was still a lot of land, but Tennessee was mostly in Union control, and those slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So Johnson, on the steps of the Capitol in Nashville, Tennessee, the building that's currently standing there now, gave a proclamation freeing all the slaves in the state of Tennessee. He did not give them voting rights. He did not give them citizenship. He just gave them their freedom. He was not a supporter of being blacks as being equals. He was not a supporter of them having citizenship, but he did support the idea of them being free. He also did not support the idea of forcing every state to give up slavery. He believed that it was for each state in its own decision to make this decision, and that led to a lot of conflicts later on in Johnson's administration. Johnson would, because of his success as the military governor of Tennessee, his own Emancipation Proclamation for the slaves in Tennessee, his loyalty to the Union, when it came time for Lincoln's re-election bid, he, instead of his first vice president, who was from Maine, Hamlin, he actually brought on Andrew Johnson. And he didn't run as a Republican. They ran as a National Union ticket in the 1964 election. And when they won, Johnson became the vice president to Lincoln. And as we know, in April 15th, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson was advanced to the vice presidency. Now, Johnson was viewed initially as a great hope because he was seen as such a strong Unionist, and he freed the slaves in Tennessee. A lot of people thought, well, this is going to be great. He's going to do a great job, and they thought he might actually be better than Lincoln did in certain aspects. That was not the case. In fact, Lincoln had a lenient idea for bringing in southern states back into the Union. Johnson was even more lenient. He only asked for a 10% oath to the Union to be readmitted in, and he also allowed the South to elect their own leaders. Most of these leaders were former Confederate leaders, former Confederate senators, former Confederate governors, and the Republican Congress was not going to have any part of that whatsoever. So he started having a rift between his Republican Congress and he who was a Democrat president. Shortly thereafter, Congress actually passed the Tenure of Office Act, and Andrew Johnson vetoed it. In fact, Johnson vetoed a lot of legislation passed by the Union, by the Congress of this time period, because he wanted a lenient, easy reunion of the states. He believed the best way to heal was to bring everyone together as soon and fast as possible. The federal government, the Congress would not seat the senators and the members of Congress elected from the newly re-entered former Confederate states. They sent them all back. The Johnson and the Congress kept fighting over this. Also, the conspirators for the Lincoln assassination. One of the people there was a woman. Her name was Mary, and she was convicted, and she was basically by 5 out of the 9 judges said, she should be, not hung. She should be sent to her life in prison. Her last name was Surratt, so Mary Surratt. And Johnson, not being aware of this, actually signed the death warrants, and she was executed in July 7th of 1865. And Johnson was unaware of the recommendation of leniency on her end about clemency from execution to life in prison. And he was called out on it about how this woman was advised to be given life sentence, to be given clemency, and why didn't Johnson do it? Johnson wasn't aware. He asked the War Department for information on this, and when he got the paperwork from the War Department, he actually saw that the recommendation by the judges for clemency had been ripped out and then reattached. There were 2 men that he believed could have done it. The one he believed done it was actually a guy named Edwin Stratton, who was the Secretary of the War Department during this time period, and Johnson immediately wrote him the next day and tried to fire him. Congress was not in session. Stanton believed that he was protected by the tenure of office law that Johnson tried to veto, a little bit earlier, and because Johnson was adamant about removing Edwin, he tried to appoint Ulysses S. Grant. He didn't try to appoint someone else, and Stratton barricaded himself in his office. When Congress came back in, they had a meltdown, and this was beginnings of the calls for impeachment. There were a couple of other things. The fact that he was going to allow the Confederate states to come back in and elect their own leaders back in. The Congress wasn't having any of that. This was basically the end of presidential Reconstruction and the beginning of the Republican congressional Reconstruction, which did work out better in the long run. Because Johnson didn't want to pass the 14th Amendment. In fact, he vetoed it. Congress overrode him, passed it, and then sent it to the states for ratification, which all the states did, in fact, have to ratify to re-enter into the Union. All the Civil War amendments, 13th through the 15th, they had to ratify them. Once the ratification was done, these states were admitted in, but Johnson was impeached anyway because he tried to remove Edwin Stanton from the Secretary of War position. And interesting thing about this law is that it was eventually challenged through a roundabout way by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was found to be unconstitutional. And so Andrew Johnson was impeached, the first president to be impeached from violating a law that was found by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. And so we should probably put that in the history books, that the law that the Congress used to impeach him was deemed unconstitutional. Should the impeachment actually stand? I don't know. There were 11 articles of impeachment, and he was impeached by the House, and he survived by one vote. One vote prevented him from being removed from office. Now, the interesting thing is that the one senator that kind of changed his vote was seen to get a lot of favors from Johnson shortly after the impeachment acquittal. And so there's speculation that there was some type of backroom dealing there for favors. But there's no actual proof of all of this, except for a couple of letters of just thanking Johnson for his service and thanking Johnson for the appointments. Johnson really would have liked to have run again for re-election, but the writing was pretty much on the wall. In the 1868 election was not going to go for Johnson. Johnson was not going to be nominated for re-election, and so he came back to Greenville. Now, Greenville, he welcomed him back as a hero. And even though his Reconstruction plans were disastrous, and we were all grateful that the plans that were followed through by the Congress were successful, I mean, basically, like, blacks were allowed to vote. Johnson didn't want that. The blacks were allowed to own land. Johnson didn't really want that. Even though he gave his slaves, his former slaves who were free house and board and land, he wouldn't give that to every other freed slave. In fact, one of his former free slaves was the chairman of the Freeman Foundation for former slaves. So it is a very complicated backstory in all this. And it's very controversial. But Johnson came back, and he came back to Greenville as a hero. Greenville still loves him. They still claim that he's the best president since Abraham Lincoln. I don't agree with that sentiment, basically because his stances on black people. He really wasn't favorable of blacks at all. And I think that if his plans would have went through, the country would have had a much harder Reconstruction. The society would have been much worse for it. So I'm grateful that his policies were very much not followed. But again, he was a Jacksonian guy. He was pushing for what he believed to be the average poor day man, which was the non-land owning, non-slave owning whites, when he really should have included everyone who was not a large landowner or a large financier, that there's a lot of people who deserved equal chance and equal opportunity that included former slaves. And I think if he would have done that, if he could have seen that as being a possibility, his term in office would have been better. I think he would have been a much better president. But again, he followed it in that Jacksonian model, which was also very racist and against the abolition of slavery and very much for the expansion of the Southern territories to the Pacific Ocean. And Johnson was just out of his time period. If he would have became president 40 years earlier, he might have been more successful. After his term in presidency, he settles back into his home here in Greenville, and by just pure charisma, which he didn't have, he was elected into the U.S. Senate, once again, from the people of Tennessee. Again, this part of Tennessee was very, very staunch Unionist throughout the entire war, and he was elected to the U.S. Senate again, the only president to be reelected and to be elected into the U.S. Senate after being president. Unfortunately, he died several months into his first term. He died on July 31st, 1875, while he was traveling around in his Senate district. He was then interred here in Greenville along with his wife and his children. His wife died January 15th of the following year in 1876. His children are all buried here. So this is the Andrew Johnson final resting place. Very, very controversial figure. There's a lot of people who try to speak a lot of praise about him. There are some good things that he did. He did free the slaves in Tennessee that he didn't have to do. He did push for the Homestead Act. If it wasn't for the Homestead Act, the settling of the West would have been much more difficult. I actually used the Homestead Act in Iowa in 1999. It was first actually challenged in Douglas County, Nebraska, and Pottawatomie County in 1879 was the first time it was actually really pressured, was in 1879 in Douglas County, Nebraska, and Pottawatomie County, Iowa. Then I used it in 1999, being a dependent child of a dependent parent in a homestead. So thanks to Johnson and Lincoln's support for the bill in 1862, I benefited from it. So everyone, this is the history, basically the rundown of Andrew Johnson. My name is Nathaniel Gavronsky. Please like, subscribe, and share. And stay healthy, stay wealthy, and as always, stay wise, America.